Hello. I'm just preparing a couple of things and then I'm going to talk to you in just a moment. Happy Friday for those that join me on this conversation today. I wasn't planning on going live as evidenced by my tracksuit that I'm wearing. Let me just post this really fast. I'm putting a donate to my campaign here. Okay. Hi. There we go. So I want to talk about a couple of things. I'm sure a lot of you have seen some of the coverage that Kamala Harris received in France. Oh, and by the way, if you can't hear me, please let me know in the comments. Sometimes I have technical issues. It happens. And let me just send this into one of my groups. My cousin's actually in Paris. I sent her a text message. I'm curious as what she says back, because I'd like to see some more of what the coverage of Kamala Harris, vice president, has actually been in France. We know in America it hasn't really been fantastic. Here we go. So let's talk about this for a second. Let's see. I think that's working okay. Yeah. Again, any issues that you have, if there's any sound issues, please let me know. Okay, so, and Kenny, I see that Kenny is maybe going to be on, so we'll see. So let's talk about this. There was a really obnoxious comment made by a journalist. Her name is Jennifer Jacobs. She follows me. So hi, Jennifer, if you're having to see this. She's a White House reporter for Bloomberg. And she wrote this really strange tweet, and it said the vice president has used the pronunciation for the word the when making a point. She's talking about Kamala Harris being in France. Some critics have claimed she appears to adopt a fake French accent when she said the plane during the tour of a research lab on Tuesday. Today at Paris press conference, she said the topic. Okay, so first, this kind of makes my brain angry on several levels. One of them is that this tweet is really cynical. It's really snarky. It's incredibly petty. And the most offensive part of it to me is that it actually serves no purpose. It doesn't give you any information, really any real information about the policy or the things that Kamala Harris is talking about in France. It's just a very snarky tweet. It's just a very cynical tweet. It doesn't deliver any information. What it does do is it looks like it tries to attempt to take down a peg or two, the first Black woman, first South Asian woman, first woman vice president the United States has ever had. That's the only purpose that I can actually see of this tweet. And unfortunately, that's pretty grotesque. I think one of the things that I have seen, this is true of Republicans and it's also true of the press, is I think that a lot of people have this desire to be post-racial. They really want our society to be post-racial. We know that when Republicans want us to be post-racial, it is because they want to be able to pass or draft policy that has a discriminatory intent, but with race neutral language, but we know that it's intended to hurt Black people, that it's intended to hurt Latino people, Asian people, Native people. But if we are a post-racial society, when they do this, then in their minds, they're saying, hey, we're just passing policy to be fair. We're just doing it for the safety of our community. We're just doing it for law and order, right? So this is some of the issues of why Republicans would like us to pretend we are a post-racial society, right? Republicans want us to pretend that it's a post-racial society so that the policy and the laws that they are trying to pass don't seem to have a racist intent, a discriminatory intent. But we know that they do, and we know that they are, okay? I'm looking one more time down here just to make sure. Um, I'm just making sure one more time that there's no sound issues. So we know that the legacy media, in a way, kind of wants this to happen as well. We know that there's parts of legacy media that would like to pretend that we are a post-racial society as well. Um, why would legacy media want us to be a post-racial society? Well, because that means that no matter how they cover Black candidates, Latino candidates, Asian candidates, Native candidates, that they can claim that they're just being fair, that they're just reporting the news, that you all are being too upset about the way we're covering. We're just saying what's on our minds and we're covering it fairly. Well, that's because of the desire that a lot of legacy media has, which is that they really want us to be a post-racial society. They want to cover us like that. And I've talked about this before. One of the things that I talked about with you all, I talk about the media a lot because, one, again, I think that the media is important. I think the media is critical. I think we should be supporting independent journalism. Shout out Dame Magazine. And we should be supporting local papers, right? But legacy media is old institutional media like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, papers that have been around for over 100 years in some cases throughout our United States. And we know that for a long time. I'm just going to let me talk about this and then talk a little bit about the past. I know that the way they're trying to cover Kamala Harris and the way they try to cover her during the 2020 election was that they really thought that we were all on an even playing ground. Really, some press people really thought that. And one of the people that I had talked to, I think his name is Jonathan Allen from NBC, and I had also spoken to Ali Veshi about this. One or both of them had said something to the extent of like, "Wow, Pete Buttigieg raised $8 million, and Kamala Harris from this huge state of California, she only raised $12 million. There must be something not as inviting about her campaign, something not as great about her campaign. I mean, if Pete Buttigieg, a gay man from a small town, could raise as much as Kamala Harris can, then maybe Kamala Harris isn't a strong candidate." So I had to talk to Jonathan Allen and talk to Alan Veshi about this. And I said to them, listen, are you not aware what it's like to be a Black female candidate in America? I mean, neither one of you are Black women, but the fact that you think that it was some easy feat for Kamala Harris to get $12 million within that first quarter and to think that that was nothing, this is just another way of like dismissing Black women's work, dismissing our presence, dismissing our effort, erasing, by the way, the obstacles that we're having to deal with, right? So to me, that was already problematic. I had witnessed it throughout the 2020 election. Now that she's vice president, there is a concerted effort, definitely with Republicans, to try to diminish her, to try to erase her. Why? Because she'll probably be a person that's going to be running for president. I hope that she will be running for president. And so what are they trying to do now? Take her down a peg or two, on and on and on, and do that right now. I feel like someone like Jennifer Jacobs got a rude awakening today, because I genuinely, and this is the sad part, this is a woman that's gainfully employed. She covers the White House. I genuinely think she didn't even think about it when she wrote that tweet. And that's bad in itself. If you're not being aware that you're writing something that is so dismissive and nitpicky and petty like that about the first Black woman, about the first South Asian woman, about the first woman vice president, this is a problem, because you are somebody that's in a legacy media outlet. You're somebody that has a lot of reach and coverage and influence. And so this is really, really problematic what Jennifer wrote. Of course, Jennifer is not the only person in the media that has written or covered Kamala Harris in this way that's been very detrimental. Now, why is it detrimental? Why is it detrimental? Because we already have, I would say, since slavery was abolished and then Reconstruction came in and then the immediate backlash to Reconstruction. You're welcome, Jennifer. Jennifer does great work at Dame Magazine. Support Dame Magazine. They actually give a damn. Okay. That should be their new slogan. They actually give a damn. Okay. We have over a century's worth of evidence of how legacy media had harmed Black people. We have that. That's there. LBJ commissioned a report called the Kearns Report in the 1960s because almost 100 Black people died in riots in Newark, New Jersey, and a few other places around the country. And a lot of people were blaming Black people, right? Newspapers were blaming Black people. Well, they're just not behaving, right? Constantly othering Black people, constantly diminishing them, constantly dehumanizing them. So when the Kearns Report came out, it was the first time really we had a study. This is why it's important to commission studies through the government. It was the first time that we had a study that said, actually, what the issue is we're dealing with a lot of poverty. We're dealing with housing issues. We're dealing with lack of employment. We're dealing with low wages. We're dealing with fear, insecurity, discrimination. And part of it is that we have a media that is covering Black people in a really dehumanizing way. That's from the Kearns Commission about 50 years ago. Okay? So we've had the evidence for a long time about that. When George Floyd was killed, we started having newspapers around the country do a quote unquote, Brett Stevens from the New York Times, fabulous journalist, said they were going on an apology tour, right? Because they looked through the history of how they had been covering Black people, and you could see it was really grotesque and detrimental and dehumanizing and othering. And there was a direct connection between the way that the media was covering Black people and how Black people were being harmed in our society, right? So it's not something that is a victimless crime, right? If we go, oh, it's just the newspapers, we can ignore that. No, we can't. Newspapers, media, they have influence, they have power. So does social media. Now, we know this, right? We have the evidence of that, okay? So when I'm looking at the way the media is covering Kamala Harris, our first Black vice president, first South Asian vice president, first woman vice president, there is a direct connection to all of that historically racist coverage that we've gotten through newspapers over the last century and a half in our country. That's not separate from that. That is a continuum of that. And that is what is so dangerous about is what's happening right now. Okay. We might think, and that's why, you know what, Jennifer, I'm going to DM you, not Jennifer Reitman. I'm going to DM Jennifer Jacobs, who follows me from Bloomberg News, because I want her to really understand this. By the way, I never get paid to educate these reporters, but to me, I feel like it's necessary because I want them to stop harming us because they're not recognizing the harm that they're causing. Okay. So again, I firmly believe that a lot of people in legacy media want us to be a post-racial society so they can just cover every candidate the way that they feel that they should without taking into consideration the historical obstacles that have been placed in front of Black people, in front of Black candidates, in front of Latino candidates, on and on and on. I want them to recognize that we're not in a post-racial society yet. And that they actually have to spend time thinking about how they're covering women, Black women, Native women, Asian women, disabled women, trans women, on and on. They need to think about how they're covering them and finding out if they're causing harm. You can tell the truth and you can report in a way that does not add harm. Okay. So I'm going to say that. That's the first thing I want to talk about. Second, let's talk about press bias for a second. We already know that studies that came out in 2020, there was a wonderful organization called StoryCorps, and they did a study. They went through 1,397 articles, and they discovered what they saw was press bias against women, and in particular, press bias against Black women. The two women that got the most negative coverage during 2022 was Kristen Gillibrand, my senator, and Kamala Harris. Kristen Gillibrand got negative coverage. Why? Because she dared to say that Al Franken should step down. Because she said maybe we shouldn't have men in Congress that think it's okay to be playfully harassing, right? She was in the right to do that. She was in the right to do that. But she received a lot of negativity because she did that, okay? And then Kamala Harris was negatively covered for everything that she did. for everything that she did, right? And that coverage really seeped into the pores of people. I had spoken to hundreds of people during the time that Kamala Harris was running, and they were repeating verbatim things that they had heard in the press about her, things that were untrue, right? And I would say, actually, that's not true, and I'll show you why. And I would give them references that they could check out themselves. Okay, so that is what the media does. The media people when the media is irresponsible, people are grabbing those words and repeating them back out. That's what they're doing. They're filtering it through their mind and right back out. That's why it's detrimental. And we know that the media is still a majoritarily white, cisgender, male run media, right? We already know this. We have the statistics from the Women's Media Center. We know that at least 63% on average, if not more, 63% of all bylines, um, articles, radio, television coverage is done and conducted by cis white males. Next is then cis white women that come after that. Black women, Latino women, Asian women, Native women, way down into the 2 percentage points to maybe 6 percentage points. And this harms us when it comes down to how Black women are covered, how Black women candidates are covered. If we're not in the press room, if we're not owning the stations, if we're not doing this, then that means that we're going to be getting our stories filtered through white journalists' mind and filtered through their biases. Implicit or explicit, they're still being filtered through that. Okay. And so I'll tell you right now, one of the newest reports showed that on Sunday shows, this is where a lot of people get their news. Sometimes people they're working a lot and then they wait till the weekend. On Sundays, they sit down and they get the news. And that is where they're getting a bulk of their news. And we know that white men dominate the press cycles on Sunday. We know that 73% of guests on Sunday shows were white. 53% were white men, 20% were white women, and then 16% were Black, 8% were Black men, 9% were Black women. And by the way, some of those are repeat guests, right? Some of them were like a guest that came on, multiple times a week. Speaking of which, I want you to see this. In 2020, of the number one guests that kept coming back on over and over again, multiple guests, all of them were white except for one Black man who's on Fox News. The top 10 guests that were on Sundays that were commenting on everything from George Floyd to racial justice to our economy were white, mostly white men and a few white women. The number one was Scott Gottlieb from the Food and Drug Administration. That's fine. Then the next was Chris Christie. He was on across all platforms 32 times, more than any other guest. After that was Rahm Emanuel. I don't know if you know him, but he's been incredibly problematic in Chicago, but he was on a lot. Then Nancy Pelosi, Anthony Fauci. We can forgive Anthony Fauci for being on television so much. Then it was Bernie Sanders, Gretchen Whitmer, and then Pete Buttigieg, right? These are people that came on multiple times, at least a dozen times, more than a dozen times, up to 42 times. That means we're not diversifying who we're getting on television on those Sunday shows, and we're not getting differences of opinion, and we're not having experts. A lot of people think that because you're in Congress, or serve in office like Pete Buttigieg or Gretchen Whitmer or Nancy Pelosi or Chris Christie, that doesn't automatically make them an expert in every subject, which means we need to have a diversity of voices that come on. I would like to see that happen because it's detrimental, right? White men were considered racial justice experts in 2020. 50% of all guests that commented on Black Lives Matter and that commented on George Floyd being killed and Breonna Taylor being killed and on were white men discussing it. Makes no sense, right? And so I'm going to leave you with some of this, okay? Because you've got a busy day, and so do I. I've got laundry to pick up. I want you to understand that the main issues of when you have a press that is majoritarily white, and some of the issues that we had with that over the last century and a half, and some of the issues that are still coming. And a lot of people are just like, what are the solutions, Maya? What are the solutions? I'm like, you know what? We have a lot of solutions already because we can look to the past and see the repeating of the same problems that we've had, right? And some of the things that we've seen that's been repeated over and over in the press and over again in our politics and over again from our politicians and in our policy is that there's a dehumanizing aspect, right? There's a dehumanizing aspect in how they're covering Black people. This is terrible. Okay, that for a very long time, if you were a Black person and you got into press, the only way that really happened is if you committed a crime. And by the way, I'm seeing that on New York One right now. New York One right now. I would love for someone to study my local news because every day I'm seeing the faces of people who commit crimes, but I'm not seeing just as many people who are doing so much good in our communities that are also Black and Latino and on and on and on, right? They constantly are having discussing crime and putting those pictures up. So this is something that there's a history of this country like that. Another thing is too that we've had for a very long time, and it has played a big role in our politics, is that they have depicted Black people and people of color as being predisposed to committing crimes or to not being as good or being as competent. That's something else that's going on with the way that Kamala Harris is being covered, right? They're making it seem like, well, maybe she's just not as competent as. Because when we're seeing the way that she's being covered versus other vice presidents of the past, I mean, we can just use it as comparison to how Mike Pence was covered. He was covered pretty favorably, overall. And every time that Kamala Harris does anything, from stepping off a plane to going to South America, or on and on and on, there's always a little tinge of negativity there. There's something that she didn't quite do right, and this is something to do to make it seem like we're less than, and that's been a big part. That has been a very big part of press coverage, And I will say this, there's something that's always been a big part of our national press too. There has been, and this is something Brett Stevens mentioned in his article about white press and how they've covered Black people in the past, was that there's always been this outright hostility towards us. Like, if they weren't just ignoring us outright, they were then being hostile. Like, how dare you get into positions of power? How dare you seek power? How dare you speak out about something like this? It was always about, how do we knock these people down a peg or two? How do we knock these people down a peg or two? That has always been something that has been a part of our press, right? And it's because this country can not get over this idea that there's this hierarchy, right? That there's a hierarchy. And that they're stressed out that hierarchy was always a false hierarchy. It was one that was constructed, and they're still not used to that. So I want you to know that that hostility is still there, and you can see that in the press. And I will also say too that there was this quick moment, that apology moment, when a lot of members of press were like, maybe we have really contributed to some of this awfulness. They were really quick to apologize and then go right back to some of the stuff that they've been doing. This is something that is not great about apologies, right? You can have an aspect of, you can have this aspect where people are apologizing, but then if they go right back to the way that what they were doing, the apology is meaningless. And again, one of the reasons why I said a lot of people want us to move straight into this aspect of being post-racial is because if they acknowledge that we're not post-racial yet, that some of the things that have harmed us in the past, whether it's coverage, the way that we're covered in the press, whether it's the harm that happened during Jim Crow, whether it was the harm that happened after Reconstruction, whether it was the harm that happened because of slavery. The reason why they don't want to acknowledge these things is because if you acknowledge them, that means that there has to be accountability. And a lot of people don't want to be accountable, right? All of us should be thinking about, how can we be better accountable, right? All of us should be thinking that. I think about it too. Like, how can I be better accountable in what I'm doing and how I present myself, and how I present and talk about other people and groups and policy and so on. Okay. So, there's a couple, just one, there was a couple of other things that I want to mention. I will say, yeah. So a lot of the past hostilities in the press, that is connected to our present hostilities. A lot of these hostilities was to try to make sure that Black people did not hold power, that they did not hold power in office, right? I had talked to someone a long time ago about, I had told her, this woman, Erin, I said, I think you should run for office. I told her this a couple years ago. And she said, I don't know why I would want to run for office. I don't think people take, like how much is it going to change if even if I run for office? I don't really think that um, things are going to change for us as Black people if I run for office. And I asked her where she got those ideas from. And she told me that she had heard for a very long time that nothing ever changes, nothing ever moves. And she told me that she kind of got that from the press, that things kind of just always stayed the same no matter what. And I realized there's this insidiousness that for a lot of Black people that are wanting to pursue power or get into power, there's two things that are always told, which is that why would you want to do it? You're not going to change anything. You're not going to move the needle. Things are going to stay the same. It's not even worth getting involved. It's not worth being political, right? That's a very insidious thing to say to people. And then there's this other aspect where they're trying to remove people out of power, trying to move people, like criticizing Kamala Harris in the way that they are. They have every right to analyze policies she's working on or how she's handling certain things as with press, but the way that they're doing it is not that, right? We can see the snarkiness and see the pettiness. So what that attempt is to try to take her down a peg or two, and also make sure that she doesn't come into power, into full power as far as like becoming president, right? And this is a way to discourage other Black women from running for office. It's a discouragement, and that's something that was that has been clear, right? So, and the last thing I want to talk about too is this idea of legitimacy. This is very important. I talked about the dehumanizing aspect that the press tries to push towards us. I've talked about the hostility the press has tried to push at us. But then the last part I want to talk about is this aspect of legitimacy. Are you a legitimate person in office? Is there, I'm not sure if you're a legitimate leader. That is a big part of the dishumanizing aspect of the press. In the past, a lot of the press would, if they mentioned Black people at all, they wouldn't use their like surname. They would address them as Mr. or Mrs., or they would misspell their names, or missay their names. And this is a way of like delegitimizing someone. This is a way of harming somebody. So I just want you to know that these types of oppressions that come from the press, it works on multiple levels. Okay, so I think that I would like to see the press move back into an apology moment, but then also talk about how are they going to fix what they're doing when it comes to reporting. I think that apologies are incredibly important. I know, I've apologized for things. I think apologizing is such an important first step, but it's not the end. It's only the first step working towards a solution. First, we have to apologize. Apologizing means that you acknowledge there has been a problem in the past, there's an issue, and that you know that it needs to be corrected. But then what comes next is the most important part and the hardest part, which is the work to fix it, to have accountability, to recognize that you can't move forward doing the same thing, and that and to me, that is real accountability. Okay. Now, thank you all for watching. I know some of you end up watching this later in the evening. And when you do, I hope that you share this. And I also would love for you to donate to my campaign. The link is below. Oh, the last thing I want to say is I want to talk about my Veterans Night. I'm going to talk about that for 2 minutes, and then I want to go. I had a really wonderful time with the veterans last night. I was with veterans from Monroe College, from Black veterans from social justice. I talked to them as a group. I talked to them individually. 2 veterans took me aside at the end of the night, and they told me that they appreciated so much the way that I listened to them and the way that I spoke to them. And also they felt that I was incredibly non-judgmental of them. And one of the things they were talking about was their trauma. I wasn't expecting these veterans to share their trauma so openly with me, but they did. They basically talked about, one of them said, listen, all of us have seen different things. All of us has been harmed in our own specific way. And to them, they had their arms around each other. They said, we really saw a lot of painful things, and it's really affected us. And they that I was so privileged that they felt comfortable telling me that, because they knew that I took their concerns seriously. I am so I promise you, I am so non-judgmental about like people using substances to cope with those issues, right? But I want to help put in place things that reduces harm, and to make sure I know what it's like to struggle to get from one moment to the next, just emotionally and mentally. And that has to do with the loss of my mom and my grandfather and grief. And grief is something that has probably been the biggest educator in my life, because it's shown me how to connect with people on a real human level and to recognize how temporary life is. And that to me means, how do we do the most good for the most people? That really is my philosophy for this campaign, and how I want to address people through policy. I want to do the most good for the most people. That's so incredibly important to me. And that means looking at the humanness of everybody, not dehumanizing anybody, and thinking about how do we make things better for everybody across the board. But anyways, I thank you for watching. Please share this. Please donate to my campaign. If you live in New York City, I've got posters coming out soon. I would love for you to help distribute them. If you want to host a fundraiser for me, I would love that. I would appreciate that. And that's it. I want you all to enjoy your weekend. Um, Jennifer Reitman, I hope everyone who consumes any news watches this. Well, I thank you for that. I will see you all soon. I'll see you on the internet. Okay, bye-bye.